Hi everybody, so today we're going to talk about the multiplication table, something that you guys are all familiar with. I'm going to show you some sequences for counting by ones and twos. Here we go. Okay, so when we count by ones, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. When we count by twos, we count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on like that. These sequences and those for 4s, 5s, 3s, and so on through 12s appear in the multiplication table, which looks like this. Okay, so here we have a multiplication table. Okay, so we are going to use a multiplication table to find the answer to a problem such as 3 times 4. We can use a multiplication table by using rows and columns. The rows run left to right, like that. And the columns run top to bottom, like that. So to find the answer to our problem here, 3 times 4, we are going to start by finding the row that begins with the 3 and the column that begins with the 4. I don't know if you can see that, but let me make it a little bit darker for you. So we're going to start here with the row that begins with the 3 and the column that begins with the 4. And then we look for the number where the row and the column meet. So if we're looking to where the rows and the columns meet, here's the 3s and here's the 4s. And they meet right here. Oops. They meet right here at the 12. And so that would be the answer to our problem. 3 times 4 equals 12. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some math vocabulary, some multiplication vocabulary. And the first word we're going to talk about is a factor. Okay, and all a factor is are the two numbers that we multiply together. So let's take our problem that we were doing before of 3 times 4 equals 12. Okay, 3 times 4 equals 12. And the two factors in our problem, 3 times 4 equals 12, are 3 and 4. Okay, so each of the two numbers multiplied is called a factor. The answer to a multiplication problem, okay, so the answer to a multiplication problem is called a product. Okay, so in this case, 3 times 4 equals 12. 12 is the product. Just like in an addition problem, the answer to an addition problem is called a sum. The answer to a multiplication problem is called a product. Okay, so one more time. In this problem, 3 and 4 are the factors, and 12 is the product. We're going to come back to our multiplication table again, and this time I want you to look at the row that begins with a 4 and the column that begins with a 3. Okay, so we're looking at the row that begins with the 4 right here and the column that begins with the 3 right here. And if we look at, if we bring the row over this way and the column down this way, we can see that where they meet is also 12. So we can see that the product of 4 and 3 is also 12. Okay, so once again, the product of 4 times 3 equals 12. This is called the commutative property of multiplication, meaning that when we change the order of the factors, it does not change the product. So the commutative property of multiplication means that changing the order of factors does not change the product. That's the commutative property of multiplication. And for an example, what that means is that if you took 3 times 4 equals 12, it means the same thing as 4 times 3 equals 12. No matter what order I put my factors, 3 times 4 or 4 times 3, I'm still going to get 12. And that is the commutative property of multiplication. We're going to learn about 2 more properties of multiplication. The next property we're going to talk about is the property of 0 for multiplication. The property of 0 for multiplication. And what the property of 0 tells us is that any number times 0 is always going to be 0. So we can do 1 times 0 equals 0. 20 times 0 equals 0. 7 times 0 equals 0. 1 million times 0 is going to be, yep, you guessed it, 0. Okay, so the property of 0 for multiplication means that any number times 0 is always going to be 0. Okay, and the last property we're going to talk about is the identity property of multiplication. Okay, the identity property of multiplication says that any number times 1 is always going to be that number. So the product of 1 and any other factor is that factor. So what that means is if we go 3 times 1, so we have a number, 3 times 1, that is always going to equal the original number. Okay, so we know 3 times 1 equals 3. And that goes for any number times 1. So we could go 15 times 1 equals 15. It equals that original factor. 7 times 1 equals 7. We can even reverse those and go 1 times 7 and still get 7. We could say 30,000 times 1 is going to be 30,000, yes. And that is because of the identity property of multiplication, which says that the product of 1 and any other factor is that other factor. Okay, so today we've learned about a multiplication table. We've learned about the commutative property of multiplication, which means that if in a multiplication problem, any factors that are reversed, so you could go 8 times 2 equals 16, means the same thing as 2 times 8 equals 16. That means that you can put the factors in any order and still get the same product. That is the commutative property of multiplication. We've also learned about the property of 0 for multiplication. And the property of 0 for multiplication says that any number times 0 always equals 0. So 5 times 0 equals 0. 10 times 0 equals 0, and so on. And the last property we learned today is the identity property of multiplication. And the identity property of multiplication means that any number times 1 is going to be that number. So 2 times 1 equals 2, or 25 times 1 would be 25. The identity property says that any number times 1 is going to be that number. Okay, good job today, everybody. This concludes our video lesson for today for lesson 28. You may now go and do your lesson practice. You will do all the problems A through O in your math notebook, and that is located on page 171 of your book. Thanks, everybody. Good job.